At Pinecrest Auto Center in the heart of Forestdale, Arkansas, the sound of screwdrivers and hammers was as common as the shuffling of footsteps coming from the back of the garage. Those footsteps belonged to Hank Wilson, a thin, stooped man in his early 60s, with eyes almost hidden beneath a grease-stained cap. Everyone there knew him simply as the janitor, the one who cleaned the bathrooms, swept up the oil spills, and emptied the trash. Hank never said much, but he never missed a day either. He had been there for years without arousing suspicion or curiosity beyond the occasional comment about his almost military-like punctuality. To most, he was just a shadow among the old cars and scattered tools. On that muggy Wednesday morning, business as usual, until a gleaming black Bentley Flying Spur was towed into the garage. The car, a luxury model rarely seen in the area, belonged to an out-of-town businessman, and all the mechanics crowded around it as if they were in front of a work of art on display. The foreman of the shop, Rick Haldeman, wasted no time in showing leadership, confidently turning the key only to hear the engine sputter strangely. None of the mechanics could identify the problem, and amid jokes and taunts, Rick issued a mocking challenge, $1,000 to whoever could get the car started before the end of the day. It was at that moment that Hank, with the broom in his hand and the raspy voice of someone who rarely spoke, calmly said he could try. The silence that followed was almost as loud as the noise of the faulty engine. At first, the entire garage thought it was a joke. Rick laughed out loud, as if Hank had said he was going to drive a Formula One car. But when they noticed he wasn't smiling, the mood changed. Without another word, Hank walked over to the tool bench, selected a few wrenches with almost surgical precision, and opened the hood of the Bentley as if he had done it 1,000 times before. The younger guys exchanged confused glances, while the veterans stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. Instead of poking around the car like the others had done, Hank went straight to the right places. He fiddled with the ignition sensors, checked the timing of the injectors, and, with a small precision wrench, adjusted an electronic component that no one had even noticed. For almost 2 hours, the shop was suspended between skepticism and curiosity. Hank didn't even stop to get a drink of water. His movements were methodical, as if he knew exactly where the defects were before he even took them apart. When he was finished, he asked for the keys with a discreet nod. When he turned the ignition, the car didn't just start. It purred with a softness that made even Rick's eyes widen. The owner of the Bentley, who had gone out to answer a phone call and was just returning, stood there in shock when he saw his car running and working better than when he arrived. "What did you do here?" he asked, not hiding his surprise. Hank simply wiped his hands on a cloth and replied simply, "I fixed what was wrong with it from the factory." And that was when the businessman looked at him closely with a frown, as if recognizing something he hadn't seen in years. The businessman's name was Douglas Maynard, and he owned a chain of luxury car dealerships in 3 states. When he looked more closely at Hank, his face paled. "Are you Henry Wilson?" he asked, this time in a serious tone. A murmur ran through the shop. Hank hesitated for a second, as if deciding whether to confirm or pretend not to have heard. But in the end, he nodded slightly. It was like dropping a bomb on the place. Douglas then added, "You designed Hydrotech's modular smart valve system in 1992. My father spoke of you as if you were a legend." At that moment, what had previously been skepticism turned to astonishment. The penny dropped all at once. This invisible janitor had been, decades earlier, a major name in the automotive industry, responsible for solutions that changed the way engines were built. The silence that had fallen was broken by Rick, trying to maintain control of the situation. "If that's true, what have you been doing here, scrubbing floors for 10 years?" he said in an acidic tone, perhaps out of shame at having been challenged. Hank looked at him, not with anger, but with a calmness that carried years of resignation. Not all talent is welcome when it threatens people who are too big. And then he went back to cleaning his hands, as if that revelation were just another detail of the day. Douglas, on the other hand, seemed shaken. He took his cell phone out of his pocket and started texting. The atmosphere, previously full of routine and workshop noise, was now plunged into a strange tension, not of conflict, but of reverence. For the first time, the mechanics looked at Hank not as the guy who collected trash, but as someone who knew more about engines than everyone else there combined. As the mechanics slowly returned to their posts, many still glanced at Hank, as if trying to reconcile the image of the silent cleaner with the legendary figure they had just discovered. Hank, for his part, went back to putting away his tools with the same meticulous discipline as ever. He wasn't seeking applause or attention. He was used to being invisible and didn't seem to know quite what to do with this sudden wave of recognition. Douglas, still incredulous, asked if he would be willing to talk later about a possible return to engineering, even if it was just as a consultant. Hank didn't answer right away, just said he had to finish what he had started, cleaning the locker rooms before work ended. At the end of the day, as the others walked away talking about what they had witnessed, Hank remained there, as usual. But there was something different in the air. One of the younger ones, an apprentice named Cody, approached him and asked if he could show him how he had identified the engine problem. For the first time in years, Hank didn't hesitate to share. He pulled out an old notebook he kept in his closet, full of handwritten notes, technical drawings, formulas, and ideas he had accumulated over the years, even while sweeping floors. Cody was impressed by the level of detail and clarity. Hank explained patiently, without arrogance, as if he genuinely wanted the other to understand. That brief conversation lasted more than an hour, and for the first time, someone saw Hank not as a former genius or a janitor, but as a master. In the days that followed, Hank's story spread like wildfire throughout the city. The news even reached local newspapers, who showed up at the garage asking for interviews. He declined them all, not out of arrogance, but because he didn't see the point in making a spectacle out of something that, for him, was just part of what he had always loved to do. Still, customers started showing up just to see the man who resurrected a Bentley and taught humility to half the garage. Rick, swallowing his pride, tried to downplay what had happened, but the mechanics themselves began to seek Hank for advice, especially the younger ones. Some even asked if he would give after-hours lessons. Hank didn't know how to react to so much attention, but little by little, he began to understand that perhaps this was a chance to reconnect with what he had left behind. Cody, the apprentice, started arriving early just to talk to him before the other mechanics showed up. He began to learn how to read blueprints, understand engine faults based on noises, and even question solutions that he had previously accepted without thinking. Hank saw in the boy a kind of curiosity that reminded him of his own youth before the boardrooms, corporate meetings, and office betrayals that had buried his career. Little by little, the routine that had once been one of silence and solitude began to include questions, shared coffee, and notebooks scribbled together. For someone who had been forgotten by everyone, this was a form of redemption that didn't come with headlines or contracts, but with something more valuable: purpose. The following week, Douglas Maynard returned to the shop. He didn't come in a suit or with an executive air. He arrived in jeans, a shirt rolled up at the elbows, and a plain envelope in his hand. He asked to speak to Hank privately. Inside the envelope was a proposal, a technical consulting contract for a new line of hybrid engines with total creative freedom, remote work, and a generous salary. Douglas wasn't there just for recognition. He needed someone like Hank to solve a real engineering problem. Hank read the document calmly, sitting in the back of the shop, where he usually rested during his breaks. He didn't respond right away, but he thanked him sincerely. At that moment, the proposal didn't feel like a prize. It felt like a choice, and he needed to think, not in a hurry, but clearly, something he had learned to do over years of living in the shadows. Later, at the end of the day, Hank was alone in the warehouse. The sound of the engines had already died down, and the sun was streaming through the tall windows, drawing streaks of light across the grease-stained floor. He picked up the contract again and stood there for a while, looking at the paper as if looking into a mirror. He thought about the years he had spent in hiding, the betrayal he had suffered when his ideas had been stolen, the anger he had had to swallow in silence. He also thought about the nights he had almost thrown away his notebooks but had not had the courage. Now, he had a choice: return to the world that had once swallowed him, or stay here, teaching those who truly wanted to learn. For the first time in a long time, he felt he could make decisions without fear, and that in itself was a form of victory. The next day, Hank arrived earlier than usual. Instead of heading straight to the closet where he kept his rags and cleaning supplies, he walked over to the work bay where Cody was already waiting for him with the hood of a car open. Before he said anything, Hank handed the boy a screwdriver and asked him to try to identify the problem himself. Cody hesitated, but Hank just crossed his arms and watched, a faint smile hidden beneath his cap. The shop was still quiet, and that moment between the two of them seemed to encapsulate everything that had changed. It wasn't about cleaning floors or proving he knew better than anyone else. It was about passing on. Hank hadn't responded to Douglas's contract yet, but the way he looked at the boy made it clear. He had found real value in something that no corporate proposal could buy. Later, during lunch, Hank sat with the other mechanics, something he rarely did. The conversation revolved around cars, old engines, and unlikely solutions that only those who had been around a lot knew about. For the first time, Hank felt like he was part of the team, not as someone who had earned status or commanded respect, but as someone who had finally been recognized spontaneously. Rick, quieter than usual, listened more than he spoke. He had not officially apologized, but something in his posture showed that arrogance had given way to reflection. The truth is that Hank's presence had changed the dynamics of the place, and no one saw him as just the old man with the mop. That workshop, which had previously ignored his existence, was now also a space where he could teach, be heard, and above all, be himself. By the end of that week, Hank had made his decision. He walked into Rick's small office, knocked calmly on the door, and asked to use the shop's phone. He called Douglas Maynard and thanked him for the offer, but said it wasn't time to return to the corporate world yet. He explained that for the first time in years, he felt useful in a way that didn't involve contracts, meetings, or status. Douglas respected his decision and said the door was always open. Hank hung up, took a deep breath and walked out of the office with the ease of knowing he no longer had to prove anything to anyone. What he had sought for decades, respect, purpose, peace, was finally there, on the concrete floor of Pinecrest Auto Center, where he found himself amid grease, engines, and a youth eager to learn. That afternoon, Cody presented his first project of his own. A simple modification to an old carburetor, inspired by one of the sketches Hank had shown him days earlier. It didn't work at first, and the boy was visibly frustrated, but Hank just smiled and said, "That's how it starts. You fail before you succeed. The secret is to keep thinking." Those words, spoken without rehearsal or fanfare, stuck with Cody like a mantra. That's where Hank's true influence showed itself, not in the great accomplishments of his past, but in the way he inspired those around him to try again. And there was something different in the boy's eyes, a confidence that comes when someone truly believes in their own potential. Hank was no longer invisible, and even without meaning to be, he was building a legacy. A few weeks later, a mural was put up at the entrance to the shop, an idea created by the employees themselves. It featured old photos of the team, projects in progress, small accomplishments, and technical notes handwritten by Hank, alongside drawings made by Cody and other apprentices. The mural wasn't for customers, it was for themselves. A reminder that behind every repair there was learning, failure, and overcoming. Hank, always discreet, tried to protest when he saw his name at the top of the board with the words "honorary mentor," but no one listened. That was the least he could do, according to his colleagues, for someone who had transformed the environment, not with motivational words or ready-made speeches, but with presence, patience, and applied knowledge. The shop, which had previously been just a place to work for many there, now began to feel like a place of growth. At home, alone with his old notebooks piled up next to the worn armchair, Hank leafed through the yellowed pages with a different look. No longer one of frustration or longing, but of acceptance. For a long time, those notes had been his only faithful companion, the only proof of who he had once been. Now, they no longer needed to serve as a shield against oblivion. They had fulfilled their role, and more than that, they were helping others find their own paths. Hank realized that his story was not being rewritten, but rather continued by other hands, in other engines, with new ideas, and that was more than enough. He didn't want the past back. He just wanted the present to have some meaning. And finally, on that workshop floor, among tools and curious voices, he had found that meaning. One Saturday afternoon, Hank stayed in the shop a little longer than usual. Everyone had already left, except Cody, who was finishing cleaning his tools. The boy turned before leaving and asked, "Do you think I'll ever know as much as you do?" Hank didn't answer right away. He looked at the partially disassembled engine on the bench, and then at the boy, now with his hands covered in grease and his eyes full of desire. "You already know more than I did when I started, and what you don't know, you'll find out your own way." Cody smiled, thanked him, and left, leaving Hank alone, just like old times. But for the first time in a long time, that loneliness didn't hurt. It was just a break before a new cycle. Hank walked over to the bulletin board, ran his fingers over the pictures and doodles hanging there, and stood there in silence for a few minutes. There, in that simple moment, Hank understood that his greatest achievement was not fixing a Bentley or being recognized by an important businessman. It was not letting frustration bury him. It was keeping going, even when no one was looking anymore. Storing knowledge like someone who saves seeds, waiting for the right day to plant. And that day arrived without fanfare, without a stage, but with meaning. The workshop was now more than a place to work. It was a space where he could teach, observe, and most importantly, trust that everything he had experienced, the mistakes, the silences, the losses, were not in vain. Hank Wilson didn't need headlines to be remembered. All he needed was to be seen by those who mattered, and that, in the end, was what changed him forever.